I used to believe that if you worked hard, stayed loyal, and kept your head down, life would reward you. My father used to tell me, the world notices those who grind quietly. Your day will come. I clung to that belief for years, even as life chipped away at it piece by piece. But the day I realized my boss had stolen everything I'd worked for and laughed about it in my face was the day I stopped believing. That was the day something inside me snapped, not in a way that left me broken, but in a way that sharpened me into something new, something dangerous. 3 years ago, I landed what I thought was my dream job, a mid level project manager at a mid sized but fast growing tech company. We weren't Google, but in our little niche, data driven logistics, we were making waves. Our software cut delivery times, optimized fuel use, and made distribution centers more efficient. It wasn't glamorous, but it was money. And in tech, money meant potential. I wasn't flashy, not the kind of person who worked a room at conferences with a fake smile and 100 LinkedIn connections. My weapon was focus. I stayed late, triple, checked every line of reporting, and quietly solved problems other people either ignored or didn't understand. I had built a reputation as reliable, not brilliant, not innovative, just steady. And then came Richard. Richard was the kind of boss that made outsiders swoon and insiders seethe. Tall, broad shouldered, with that permanent half smile of a man who knew he was the smartest in the room. His suits were tailored, his hair always perfect, and he had the kind of easy charisma that made board members lean in during presentations. To them, he was a visionary. To us, his team, he was a tyrant. Richard loved control. He loved credit even more. He'd steal an idea from a meeting and, within a week, present it to the board as if it had sprung fully formed from his genius mind. When things went wrong, he threw subordinates under the bus with surgical precision, never leaving a trace of blame on himself. At first, I tried to avoid his spotlight. I stayed in my lane, content to let him play king while I focused on the work. But Richard had a way of finding weaknesses, and when he realized I wasn't a political player, he decided I was perfect prey. It started small. He'd forget to mention my name in meetings, even when he was using my data. He'd make little jokes about how I needed training wheels when I presented something, undercutting me just enough to make everyone chuckle. One time, after I spent 2 weeks putting together a cost savings model, Richard presented it to the board. My name wasn't even on the slides. When I brought it up, he smiled that predator's smile and said, "You're young. Exposure is for the company, not individuals. Don't be selfish." I swallowed it, because that's what I always did. I told myself it didn't matter who got the credit as long as the work stood for itself. But then came the project that broke me. It started as a side project, something I tinkered with after hours because I couldn't stop thinking about it. A predictive algorithm for supply chain disruptions, built on a hybrid of weather data, labor strike probabilities, and geopolitical risk. If it worked, and my prototype showed it did, it could save companies millions by predicting delays weeks before they happened. For 6 months, I poured myself into it. Nights, weekends, skipped dinners. My girlfriend at the time left me, saying she was tired of competing with spreadsheets. Fair enough. I believed in what I was building. I believed it would be my shot. When it was ready, I showed Richard. I remember the way he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers, pretending to think deeply. Then he smiled. This could be revolutionary. But it's raw. You're not ready to present this to the board. Let me polish it. My stomach sank, but I nodded. He was my boss. What else could I do? 2 weeks later, Richard stood in front of the board, polished slides behind him, and unveiled his revolutionary new predictive algorithm. Mine, he didn't just steal it. He repackaged it, dressed it up, and paraded it like a prize racehorse. My work, my sleepless nights, my sacrifice erased. And then the worst part, halfway through the presentation, he made a point to say, "Of course, I had my team crunch some numbers, but this was really a solo vision." One of those midnight light bulb moments. I sat there in the back of the room, my throat dry, my hands shaking. Every time a board member nodded approvingly, it felt like a knife twisting deeper. Afterward, when I confronted him, Richard didn't even bother pretending. He shut his office door, looked me dead in the eyes, and said, "Listen, kid, you wouldn't know how to sell this if your life depended on it. I'm doing you a favor. Be grateful I let you keep your job. If you don't like it, there's the door." Then he laughed, actually laughed. That laugh echoed in my head for weeks. At first, I spiraled. My performance review suddenly tanked. Richard made sure of it. Projects were reassigned. My colleagues, sensing blood in the water, distanced themselves. I went from being the reliable workhorse to the ghost in the corner. Some days I thought about quitting. Other days, darker thoughts crept in. But then something shifted. I realized Richard had given me a gift. That day, when he stole my work, he showed me exactly who he was: arrogant, greedy, careless, and underneath it all, deeply insecure. For the first time in my life, I stopped being afraid of people like him. And I started thinking, if he could take everything from me so easily, what would happen if I turned the tables? I didn't know it then, but that was the first day of the end of Richard's life as he knew it. The day I decided to fight back, it didn't feel cinematic. There was no dramatic thunderclap, no triumphant music. Just me sitting in my tiny apartment at 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling and realizing I couldn't let Richard win. He had taken my work, my confidence, and almost my sanity. If I walked away now, I'd be another casualty in his climb up the corporate ladder. Another nameless victim whose silence made him stronger. But I wasn't going to be silent, not anymore. When you've been blindsided enough times, you start to learn the rhythms of your attacker. Richard wasn't subtle. He thrived on showmanship, quick wins, and the kind of dirty tricks that only worked if no one was looking too closely. So I started looking closely. I kept a notebook. Nothing digital. I didn't trust that he wouldn't find a way to snoop. Just an old leather-bound journal with coded shorthand only I could understand. Every time he lied in a meeting, I wrote it down. Every time he promised deliverables that weren't his, I logged it. Every snide remark, every sudden stroke of genius that coincided with someone else's late-night work, it all went into the book. At first, it felt petty, almost paranoid, but patterns started to form. And those patterns revealed something I hadn't fully seen before. Richard wasn't just ambitious, he was reckless. The company reimbursed executives for travel and expenses, of course, but I noticed Richard's reports were always padded. Meals that just happened to cost the maximum allowed, hotel stays that didn't line up with the conferences we attended, flights that were always first class even when policy dictated otherwise. I had access to some of the financial systems. Not all, but enough to cross-check a few things. Carefully, slowly, I compared his expense reports to actual receipts when they passed through my projects. A 200 meal that turned out to be a 45 lunch. A team dinner where the only attendee was him. Fraud. Small scale, maybe, but fraud nonetheless. And if there's one thing about small frauds, it's that they usually sit on top of bigger ones. I knew I couldn't take him down alone. Richard had friends in high places and a terrifying ability to spin narratives in his favor. If I went at him without backup, I'd just get crushed. So I started testing the waters with colleagues. Not everyone, only those who had their own scars from Richard's games. There was Jenna, a senior analyst who once had an entire quarter's worth of work dismissed as redundant because Richard wanted to pitch his own inferior model. She was still bitter. There was Mark, a soft-spoken developer who had been denied a promotion 3 years in a row because Richard needed him where he was. And then there was Simone from HR, smart, sharp-eyed, and fed up with Richard's habit of belittling junior staff. I didn't spill everything, not yet, but I planted seeds. Questions like, do you ever notice how Richard, or did it seem odd when, and the responses told me enough they knew. They all knew. They just thought nothing could be done. That was about to change. Richard loved to brag. He bragged about deals, about his car, about his supposed networking trips that always seemed to involve golf resorts in Florida. And sometimes, when he'd had a few drinks at company mixers, he'd brag about women, about keeping options open. Even though he had a wife at home, he'd laugh, nudge the guys, make crude jokes that left me wondering how someone so sloppy hadn't already been caught. I didn't want to drag his personal life into this, at least not at first. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized Richard's ego was a double-edged sword. He thought he was untouchable, which meant he left trails. So I started watching. Nothing illegal, just observation. Which bars he went to, which nights he worked late, but his car wasn't in the lot, which female employees he hovered around too long. It didn't take long. One Friday night, I saw him at a hotel downtown, arm wrapped around a woman who definitely wasn't his wife. I didn't take a picture yet, but I logged the time, the date, the place. It was ammunition. Not my first bullet, but one I could keep chambered. For months, I built my case quietly. And for months, Richard kept being Richard, cocky, arrogant, oblivious. But there were moments that nearly gave me away. Once, I stayed late downloading a set of financial reports. My heart nearly stopped when Richard walked back into the office at 9:30 p.m. He was on the phone laughing, distracted. I ducked behind a cubicle wall, barely breathing until he disappeared into his office. I slipped out 30 minutes later, my pulse still hammering in my ears. Another time, Jenna almost blew my cover when she asked in a meeting, didn't OP already suggest this 2 weeks ago? Richard's eyes flicked to me, sharp and suspicious. I forced a smile, shrugged, and said, maybe, but I didn't phrase it as well. He smirked, satisfied with the flattery. Inside, I wanted to strangle him. Those close calls reminded me I had to play the long game. It was Simone, surprisingly, who gave me the key. We were having coffee one afternoon when she leaned across the table and said, you know Richard's been skimming from the contractor budgets, right? I froze. What do you mean? She lowered her voice. Some of the contracts he signs off on, inflated. He approves. They kick back a percentage to him. It's not official, but people talk. I felt a slow, dangerous smile spread across my face. If that was true, then Richard wasn't just a narcissist. He was a criminal, and criminals leave evidence. From that moment, everything clicked into place. I wasn't going to just embarrass Richard. I wasn't going to just get him fired. I was going to burn his entire empire to the ground. The fraud, the affairs, the bullying, it would all come out piece by piece like dominoes falling in perfect sequence. And the best part, I wouldn't even have to lie. I'd just hold up a mirror and let the world see the monster he really was. But first, I had to be patient. I had to build my trap so carefully that by the time Richard realized he was caught, it would already be too late. I closed my leather bound journal one night, the pages thick with months of notes, and whispered to myself, "Your day is coming, Richard. And when it does, you'll wish you'd never laughed at me." I'd always imagined revenge would feel like flipping a switch, one moment powerless, the next powerful. But in reality, it was slow, calculated, like setting fire to a field of dry grass one match at a time, knowing the blaze would spread whether you were there to watch it or not. Richard had no idea the field was already burning under his feet. It started with the expense reports. I didn't go to the board directly. That would have been suicide. Richard had their ears wrapped up tight, and if I accused him without proof, I'd be branded a jealous underling trying to make waves. So instead, I planted seeds. One morning, I drafted an anonymous email with a few select discrepancies highlighted, small ones, but enough to raise eyebrows. I used a burner account routed through a VPN and sent it not to the board, but to the internal audit department. Auditors don't need much to start sniffing. By design, their job is suspicion. Within 2 weeks, whispers started circulating. Richard brushed it off when asked, laughing about clerical errors and overzealous bean counters. But I watched his jaw tighten, his eyes flicker. He was worried, and that was only the beginning. While the auditors poked around, I played my second card. Remember that hotel downtown? Richard hadn't just gone once. He was a creature of habit, and habits make people sloppy. Over 3 months, I logged 4 separate nights where he went in with the same woman. This time, I took pictures. Not blurry paparazzi-style shots, clean, undeniable images, his arm around her waist, his hand brushing hers, the kiss outside the revolving door. I didn't send them to his wife. Not yet. That would come later when it would sting the most. Instead, I kept them in my vault, along with the journal, the financial notes, and every damning piece of evidence I'd collected. The noose was tightening, but Richard still strutted through the office as if nothing could touch him. That arrogance was exactly what I needed. The final stage required patience and precision. Richard's biggest weakness wasn't the fraud or the affair. It was his hunger for recognition. He couldn't resist the spotlight. If I dangled the right opportunity, he'd lunge for it without question. So I created one. With Jenna's help, I drafted a proposal for a fake client partnership, something big enough to look like a golden goose, but just vague enough to be believable. The kind of opportunity that would make Richard salivate. We leaked it strategically. I left a folder, accidentally, open on my desk one evening, filled with mock data and projections. Richard noticed. He always noticed. 2 days later, he called me into his office. "What's this about a potential Eastbridge logistics partnership?" he asked. Eyes sharp. I feigned surprise, then hesitation. "It's nothing. Just a hypothetical, not really ready for review." He leaned back, smirking. "You're holding out on me, kid. That's not smart." And just like that, he took the bait. Within a week, Richard was presenting the partnership to the board as if he'd brokered it himself. He didn't ask questions. He didn't check the data. He was too blinded by the chance to shine. I made sure the board's expectations skyrocketed. And then I waited. It unraveled faster than I imagined. 2 board members reached out to Eastbridge Logistics to discuss the partnership Richard had promised. Of course, there was no Eastbridge. The email domain led to a dead end. The phone number redirected to a disconnected line. When confronted, Richard stammered. He insisted there must have been a miscommunication, that someone on his team had dropped the ball. He tried to pin it on me, but I'd prepared for that too. The night before the board meeting, I slipped an anonymous packet into the chairman's inbox. Inside, copies of Richard's falsified expenses, time-stamped photos of his hotel trusts, and detailed logs of the fraudulent contractor kickbacks Simone had tipped me off to. Not accusations. Evidence. I'll never forget that day. The conference room was packed, the air thick with tension. Richard strutted in, all fake confidence and Kalan, ready to spin his usual magic. But this time, it didn't work. The chairwoman cut him off mid-presentation. "Richard, we've received some troubling information. Care to explain?" She slid the packet across the table. Richard's face went pale as he flipped through the pages. The receipts, the photos, the signatures on contracts that tied him to inflated budgets. He tried to laugh it off at first, the way he always did. "This is absurd, fabricated. Someone's trying to sabotage me." But then the auditors entered, files in hand, confirming weeks of investigation. The room shifted. Eyes that once admired him now glared with suspicion, disgust. And then the final nail, one of the board members casually mentioned they'd spoken to Eastbridge Logistics directly. "Funny thing," he said, voice dripping with sarcasm. "They've never heard of you." Richard's mask cracked. He sputtered, red-faced, pointing fingers, desperate. But the evidence was undeniable. For the first time since I'd known him, Richard wasn't in control. He was cornered. As if professional ruin wasn't enough, fate, or maybe just my careful timing, delivered the coup de grace. Richard's wife arrived at the office that very afternoon. She stormed into the building, clutching an envelope of photos I'd mailed her anonymously a week earlier. Photos of Richard at the hotel. The shouting could be heard 3 floors down. Words like cheater, disgusting, and lawyer echoed through the halls. When she left, she wasn't wearing her wedding ring. Richard staggered out of the building an hour later. Eyes hollow, skin ashen. The king had been dethroned. I didn't gloat. Not openly. I sat at my desk, quietly typing, while the office buzzed with gossip and shock. But inside, my chest burned with something I hadn't felt in months: satisfaction. Richard had taken everything from me once. Now, I'd taken everything from him, and the best part, he still didn't know it was me. I used to wonder if karma was real, if the universe truly had a way of balancing the scales. But after watching Richard's downfall unfold piece by piece, I stopped wondering. I knew the board meeting was only the beginning. Richard wasn't fired on the spot. That would have been too clean, too merciful. Instead, the board launched a formal investigation. His access badge was deactivated, his office sealed. They announced he was on administrative leave pending review. In corporate speak, that's the kiss of death. Within 24 hours, whispers spread like wildfire. The man who once strutted through the halls as untouchable was suddenly radioactive. People who used to laugh at his jokes avoided eye contact. His name became shorthand for dead man walking. I remember overhearing 2 interns in the break room. "You hear about Sinclair?" One whispered. "Yeah. Fraud. Dude's done. Crazy." Thought he was bulletproof. I sipped my coffee silently, pretending not to listen. Inside, I savored every word. 2 weeks later, the personal bombshell hit. Richard's wife filed for divorce publicly. Court documents revealed accusations of infidelity, financial deception, and irreconcilable betrayal. She wasn't just leaving him quietly, she was tearing him apart in the open. I'd left breadcrumbs for her: bank statements showing Richard's hidden accounts, photos of his hotel rendezvous, proof of gifts bought with company funds. By the time she marched into her lawyer's office, she had enough ammunition to nuke him in family court. She got the house, she got the cars, she got custody. Richard got the humiliation of his private sins plastered across legal records that anyone could pull up online. But the true destruction came when the feds got involved. The auditors had uncovered more than expense padding. They found wire fraud. They found evidence of tax evasion. Richard had been rerouting contractor payments into shell companies, then siphoning money back into personal accounts. That's not just unethical, that's criminal. One chilly morning in December, Richard was escorted out of his gated neighborhood in handcuffs. The news spread faster than wildfire. Photos of him red-faced, hair disheveled, stuffed into the back of a squad car. Every major business outlet covered it. Corporate VP arrested in fraud scandal. His name trended on Twitter for 3 straight days. I watched it unfold on my laptop with a glass of whiskey in hand, the amber liquid catching the glow of the screen. Every headline felt like a personal apology from the universe. In corporate America, reputation is currency. And Richard, he went bankrupt overnight. Every article, every blog post, every LinkedIn whisper branded him a fraudster, a cheat, a disgrace. The man who once lectured me about career suicide had detonated his own professional future with both hands. No company would touch him. His speaking gigs were canceled, his professional memberships revoked, even his old college scrubbed him from their alumni magazine. By the time his trial date was set, Richard Sinclair had gone from rising star executive to cautionary tale. And me, while Richard's life smoldered, mine was catching fire in the best way. The board, eager to distance themselves from the scandal, quietly promoted me to acting director. They spun it as new leadership, new integrity. Suddenly, the projects I'd once been sidelined from were mine to steer. Jenna and I worked late nights, rebuilding the department's credibility. Simone returned quietly vindicated, her name cleared. Together, we reshaped the culture Richard had poisoned, and every win felt like a final nail in his coffin. I didn't expect to see him again. Not really. But fate has a sick sense of humor. 6 months after his arrest, I spotted him outside a courthouse downtown. He was thinner, grayer, his expensive suits replaced by off-the-rack department store clearance. A man who used to exude arrogance now shuffled with the slump of defeat. Our eyes met across the street. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then Richard looked away. That, more than anything, told me I'd won. Richard's trial dragged on for months. Fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion. By the time the verdict came, the man was a husk of his former self. The sentence: 8 years in federal prison. When the gavel fell, I didn't cheer. I didn't smirk. I simply closed my laptop and took a deep breath. It was over. The man who'd once tormented me, exiled me, and mocked my worth was now stripped of everything: his job, his wealth, his marriage, his freedom. And he'd done it all to himself with just a little nudge from me. Revenge stories often end with fire and fury, but mine ended with something quieter: peace. I moved into a new apartment, small but filled with sunlight. I started jogging again, reconnecting with parts of myself I'd buried under stress. Jenna and I became more than colleagues, though that's a story for another time. Every so often, I'd Google Richard's name just to see if anything new popped up. Mostly, it was just legal updates and stale headlines. His digital footprint was a graveyard, and I'd close the browser smiling. Richard had tried to destroy me. Instead, he destroyed himself, and I made sure the world watched.